we really don't know exactly who these people were. In fact, we know from the evidence that we have, and I'm someone that believes very, very strongly you have to follow the evidence. Yes, you can speculate a little bit, but it should be based on evidence, and strong evidence, the stronger the better. I'm very much a physical scientist. So when we look at Göbekli Tepe, they were incredibly sophisticated people. I don't know where they came from. I want to be very straightforward. I don't think they were aliens from outer space. I don't think they tied in with, for instance, Denisovans from Siberia 50,000 years earlier. I mean, there's a lot of speculation that people say, oh, they migrated from this place or that place. Well, we really don't know at this point because there's just not that much evidence. When you're pushing things back and you're looking at archaeological sites from 12,000 years ago and earlier, one thing that I'm trained in is a field of what survives over time. And as you go back over time, less and less survives, and it actually drops off exponentially in many cases, what survives. So you have to work with evidence that we have. So I am hesitant at this point, and I will not speculate as to where they came from. They may have just arisen in that very area. I mean, let's just say, I like to think of them as the Göbekli Tepe people. Of course, that's what we call them. We don't know what they call themselves. We don't have, in my opinion, any good evidence that they migrated from somewhere else, that they came from some other known population. People can take two dots and connect them. That doesn't mean they're really connected. But what's important is that they were incredibly sophisticated. So when we look at the actual evidence, they were very, very sophisticated. They had a civilization that I believe was a true civilization that had all the components that archaeologists look for and historians look for when they're trying to identify a civilization in the archaeological record. And I want to elaborate on that for just a second, because there are three main points that people often use in the archaeological record to identify true civilization. One is monumental architecture, monumental structures. We certainly have that at Göbekli Tepe. In fact, they are so sophisticated that when I've spoken off the record to archaeological colleagues and asked them, well, if you saw one of these Göbekli Tepe pillars, or you saw, I call it the beast, that's on one of the pillars in enclosures C, you know the one I'm talking about, in the round, or some of these other structures, some of these other carvings, and you did not have a context, you did not have stratigraphy, you did not have radiocarbon dating, which we have for Göbekli Tepe. We have all of those to put it into a real time frame. If you just had it in isolation and you looked at it and had to guess as to how old it is, I've had archaeological colleagues tell me off the record, oh, maybe 600 BC, maybe 1000 BC, because it's so sophisticated. But we're talking 9, 10,000 BC. So they are incredibly sophisticated. This is, in many ways, one of the oldest, perhaps the oldest sophisticated culture we have, other than perhaps Egypt, where my work also goes. Interestingly, of course, Göbekli Tepe, and you can tell me better. And I don't know how far back that name goes, but it is interesting that it seems to be Potbelly Hill, or a hill with a navel, etc. Um, uh, the navel, the birth. So some people have interpreted this as maybe the birth of civilization, at least locally. But, that's speculation. Either way, this is incredibly sophisticated at incredibly early age. So getting back to civilization, we have monumental architecture. We have, I believe, literacy. And I say that, and I say it carefully. I believe there's good evidence, and we have to consider the possibility that the Göbekli Tepe people were literate, that they had some kind of writing, they had some kind of written notation. I speculated about this years ago when I first was looking at Göbekli Tepe, because how would you organize the people? How would you make plans for these enclosures, carving? How would you carve them out and erect them? Something that I see at Göbekli Tepe is that this is not necessarily the biggest stone structures in the ancient world, not necessarily the most impressive from that point of view. When you stand in front of the Great Pyramid, yeah, it's amazing. Göbekli Tepe has other aspects of impressiveness. Those pillars carved from limestone, I'm saying this as a geologist, to carve those, to erect them, thin and tall without breaking them, without snapping them, that takes real sophisticated technology, real organization, real planning. How would they do this if they didn't have a way to plan it out, have essentially, we'll call it in modern terms, blueprints or plans? So I often speculate there must be some type of writing. And something that I've looked at recently is the symbolism. Are the symbols on the pillars? I'm more and more convinced that those symbols actually are part of the Göbekli Tepe language, if you would, or written language, and seem to tie in with later Anatolian hieroglyphs that we know. So, second aspect of civilization that many people look for is writing or literacy. So I think there's evidence that we have that at Göbekli Tepe. Now, most of the writing may have been on what we would call parchment or some kind of materials that would collapse, etc. But would be lost, and all we have is stones. But think about our own modern civilization. If all we had was a couple of I don't know, carved stones that were part of building facades, and someone 12,000 years later came by, would they know that we were literate? So you have to put this into context. So we've got monumental architecture, we've got literacy, and the third thing that people look for is cities. That's why civilization actually comes from the concept of cities, urban centers. And many archaeologists have said, no, Göbekli Tepe is just a temple. I actually don't buy that it's a temple. I don't accept it as a temple per se, and I should talk about that in a minute. I think it's a lot more than a temple. I'm not even sure that we should call it a temple. As a side note, if archaeologists, and I'm not trying to be mean, but archaeologists, and I'm trained this way, if you don't know what it is, it's easy to call something either a temple or a tomb, because that covers a lot of what people find in the archaeological record. But cities, urban centers, large settlements, most archaeologists who have studied Göbekli Tepe have said, well, where's the urban center? Where is the city that would go with it? This is not a settlement, although human bones have been found there. Evidence of feasting and food has definitely been found there, but it's not generally been accepted as a setting where people were living, where they were settled. Well, that Egypt, I know Egypt well. You have the pyramids, you have the Sphinx, you have the temples. We don't have the cities anymore in general that the Egyptians were living in. We don't have that for Göbekli Tepe, one could argue, but one could also argue that we do have it. Maybe one of the cities of the Göbekli Tepe people is now covered by modern Urfa, Şanlıurfa. And in fact, and I've talked to my Turkish colleagues and friends, and they point out, sometimes off the record, but that when they dig there, when they build a new apartment or underground complex or parking lot, they often hit low levels of strata archaeological material from the Göbekli Tepe times. And one of the classic examples now of this, and I think he's just incredible, is the statue that was found near the pools of Abraham. during excavations. I think it was, if I remember correctly, it was basically what in America we would call uh, uh, rehabilitation, or what's the word I want, urban renewal, or that type of thing. When you're modernizing, you're doing excavations to build a new housing or whatever it might be, but right in Urfa, these things are found. And of course, Urfa, we already know, is a very, very ancient city, the city of Abraham and the prophets. I think personally that we have real evidence that Urfa goes back to Göbekli Tepe times, maybe one of the oldest cities that's been continuously inhabited on Earth. So when certain people say, "Oh, well, where was the city of the Göbekli Tepe people?" We may have it, but still being occupied. And then, of course, there's so much that we haven't been able to discover yet, or we're just on the beginning of it. I remember standing at Göbekli Tepe with Professor Schmidt, Klaus Schmidt, and he waves his hands around and says, "Look at all these hills out there. How many of those were also covering over the remains of this civilization? How many of those are also essentially artificial mountains, if you would, or the tops of mountains that have been covered over, just as Göbekli Tepe was purposefully covered over?" So there is so much that we don't know. Göbekli Tepe has only been excavated, just a very small percentage has been excavated. A lot of people say 5% of it or so. We know from geophysics that there's a lot more under the ground that has to be excavated or will be excavated, I hope, someday at Göbekli Tepe. So it's just an incredible sight.